another great day for British democracy. Today, the Labour Party has suspended their Cowdenbeath and Kirkcaldy candidate for racist remarks. At first, they resisted it, but after some hours, they decided that the person involved was, in fact, too big of a liability. Now, of course, to all of you who are the occasional viewers of BBC Scotland News, it will come as no surprise to learn that she was a big favourite with them, masquerading sometimes as a union official. Tonight, we'll be talking to another new guest. We'll be talking to Callum Cox. And he's joining us tonight to talk about a vast range of topics, including antimatter, the universe, sectarianism, independence, young Scots, and so much else besides. So I said this would be entertaining. It'll also be eclectic. And he will be taking your questions live. There's still time, obviously, to put a question. You'll see the details on the screen. TNT stands for the Nation Talk. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Well, now to our guest tonight, Callum Cox. Thanks for joining us, Callum. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm doing grand. Thank you for having me. Yeah, no, it's excited.
It's a great pleasure. Well, we're excited to have you. The interesting thing about, I mean, we've got so many things to talk about. We're spoiled for choice tonight. So we're going to have to be really quite sort of focused here, I suspect. But let's start off with telling us what is antimatter?
I guess to start off with, the way to think of antimatter is it's like matter. We're made of matter. All of us, everything that you see around you is made of matter. Antimatter is identical to matter in every single shape and form, except it behaves as if it moves backwards through time. That sounds,
Backwards.
yeah, it's epic. It's genuinely fantastic. You look at the physics of it, you look at the maths behind it, and the way that you represent antimatter is it is like moving backwards through time. So instead of obviously moving forward, moves backwards. And on top of that, very, very simple thing is that if it has a charge, it flips charge. That is it. That is the entire definition of antimatter. It's genuinely not as confusing as it sounds. But when antimatter and matter collide, bang, huge, massive explosion, and it is fantastic. Granted, chaotic, and I'm glad the universe does not have much antimatter in it, because otherwise we'd be very dead. But it's really interesting, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to kind of research some of this with my PhD.
Good. So, somebody once told me, and I'd love to know if this is true. I mean, I've just found this extraordinary, that most of what we see is empty space. In other words, if you take the atomic structure, which I guess is where you spend a lot of time thinking and working, that if you take the atomic structure, most of that atomic structure is empty. And you could actually condense all the people in the world, if you took all the empty space into a little cube and hold it in the palm of your hand. Now, is there any truth in that?
Yes. It obviously depends on the size of the cube, but you absolutely can. Over I can't remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but it's over 90% of the size of the atom is just empty space. It is absolutely ridiculous how little space these components of the atom actually take up. So you could, in theory, if you were to align everything up side by side and ignore the other physics laws that you'd have to break to be able to do that, you could condense everyone down into a tiny, tiny, wee cube.
And is your work based on quantum theory? Is that where you spend a lot of your time dealing with?
Ish. For my undergrad, absolutely. I did a lot of quantum communication and quantum security, in particular for nuclear security as well during my undergrad, doing quantum theory. At the moment, it's now looking at least for my experiment, is there's physics that we understand at the moment. Turns out the physics that we understand is just objectively wrong, and we've proven that it's wrong. And that could explain why the universe is made of matter and not antimatter. So that's kind of my job at the moment is to look into that. Yes, it touches on a little bit of quantum theory, but it's less so on the quantum side of it and more so on the, okay, we have physics wrong. Why do we have physics wrong?
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that, because, I mean, people look at the world around them, and most of us don't know anything about the atomic and the subatomic world. So when we look at quantum theory, we get confused, at least I do, because I read, for example, that a particle could be in two places at the same time, depending on whether you're looking at it or not. And
Yes.
you think, well, say, this is the whole Schrodinger's bit. You think, how can that be? You mean, and I read recently, I mean, I just find this incredible, so I very much welcome your view, that one particle could be connected to another particle at the other end of the universe.
Yes.
Is that the case?
Yeah. It's something called quantum entanglement. It's fantastic. I actually did a little bit of this in my undergrad as well. The idea being is that you can have two particles where it doesn't matter where they are, could be photons, doesn't matter where they are. You could have one in your hand right now, 1 billion miles away in the Andromeda galaxy, way off in space. And if you were to measure that photon, maybe you wanted the polarization of it, you wanted to know,
Yeah.
first polarizing glasses, you would know the polarization of the particle way off in the Andromeda galaxy instantly, because they are entangled, because these things, it doesn't matter how far apart they are still connected, and at a quantum level, it's fantastic.
Hold on a second here, Cal. Accepting your complete description there, is it the case if I alter a particle here and now that's entangled to something at the other end of the universe, that other particle would be affected instantly?
Yes.
How is that possible? I thought Einstein told us that nothing could go faster than the speed of light.
Yes. It's I don't want to go into the very nitty-gritty complexities of it, but the very surface level is that when you create these quantum entangled states, when you create this entanglement, it's locked in, meaning that it doesn't matter what you do to it, doesn't matter how you measure it, it's locked in from the second you create it, which means that it doesn't break the law of the speed of information. And so it's fine. It doesn't seem like it's fine, but it absolutely is.
So, well, I'm so glad you granted us that sort of qualification there. It doesn't seem fine. It certainly doesn't seem fine. I mean, I read it. I entirely accept what you say. We've had a question here, and it's a reasonable question, I have to say. Are we all really made up of stardust?
Yes. Yeah, we are.
So, I mean, somebody told me, and I'd love your thoughts on this, that right now, as I drink a glass of water, I am consuming a few atoms from Marilyn Monroe.
Potentially, probably, very likely. You're definitely drinking a dinosaur. There's no two ways about that. Definitely.
I love it. I love it.
But it's fantastic. It's great. Like the idea that we're all made of stardust, because it is. It's a really nice idea. Like we're all a bit special. We're all a bit made of stardust, and it's. I don't know. I just think it's fantastic.
Well, it's fantastic. How do you explain to people? Because you must be asked this, Callum. You must be asked this. People look at the physical world and say, how can this atomic and the subatomic world behave differently to what I see round about me?
So, the easiest way I've kind of explained this before, especially to like younger physics students, is something called magnitude. Now, you don't need to understand that. What you do need to understand is that as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, the physics changes. Now, what's interesting is actually as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, it's not that the physics changes, it's that you can make assumptions. So you don't need to be as precise because you're at such a large scale. But the smaller and smaller and smaller you go, you have to be even more precise. So technically, the physics that we kind of use at our level is all based on kind of assumptions that are far less precise. But the uncertainty of that is so small because we're so big compared to like atoms and stuff that it just doesn't matter. But you could, in theory, apply the maths that we use at a quantum level to our level. It would just be so complex that I imagine it would probably break every computer on the planet.
Yeah. Amazing. So let's talk about you, because I know people are very interested in quantum mechanics. I know they are. But they really want to know who Callum Cox is. Tell us about yourself, Callum.
I am 24 years old. I am a particle astrophysics PhD candidate in my third year. Because I'm 24, I'm actually younger than the Scottish Parliament itself, which is, it's always quite an interesting thing to say that to some of the older Scottish activists who, even those that were just born a few years older than me, that just can't wrap their head around that. It also means I was too young to vote in 2014 and 2016. So, you know, when it comes to independence, when it comes to the EU, my generation, which is called Generation Yes, roughly about 600,000 voters in Scotland, or 1 in 7 voters, have not had their voice heard. The next generation is coming along, and we want our bloody say. And so that's kind of what brought me into kind of the SNP, I suppose. I'm from West Lothian as well. Grew up around West Calder and Livingston. If anyone knows it, it's a fantastic place. West Lothian, best Lothian, screw East Lothian, Mid Lothian, just, you know, what can I say? I'm also an active member of the SNP as well, as I said. I'm the convener of the DMG, so I'm really passionate about disability rights as well as care rights, and in particular, when it comes to what I do in science, accessibility of information, because one of the biggest issues that we're facing at the moment is the absolute peddling of disinformation that we're seeing from sources like the BBC, from sources like mainstream media that have stopped fact-checking. They are happy to platform misinformation because they don't want to get called out for not platforming certain people. And that's really dangerous. That's really concerning. So it intertwines with disability rights a lot of the time, because accessibility of information is often overlooked for disabled people like myself, like many other people. You know, if you post something, if you post a report in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, technically speaking, it is free. The information is right in front of you. You can read that, but you're going to have to invest a lot of time and energy just to translate the ancient Egyptian into actual understandable language. So the information is not accessible. It's free, but it's not accessible. And that's something that, you know, kind of drew me to wanting to be active in the DMG, because that's something that's particularly common for a lot of younger disabled people when they're trying to interact with society.
You wrote a piece, and maybe this will help folks construe your approach to these matters specifically. You wrote a piece, I think it was in Byline, Scotland, Why England Needs Scottish Independence. Can you summarise that for us, Callum?
Yeah, very simply put, England does need Scottish independence. It is as simple as that. The reality is there's this quixotic notion that reform within the UK is possible, and quite frankly, it isn't. I don't want to go into too much detail because there's so much I can talk about with this, but fundamentally, making Scotland equal, or Wales and Northern Ireland for that matter, does not necessarily mean to say that we will be given equal treatment. The equality of reform does not result in the equality of outcome. And so that means that, as far as I'm concerned, reform isn't possible within the current Westminster system. If Scotland were to go independent, that could provide a constitutional catalyst to allow for genuine, democratic, pragmatic, and economic reform for communities the length and breadth of these islands, all the way up and all the way down to Scilly. Doesn't matter whether they live in Scotland or not. That constitutional catalyst will finally provide the necessary break to the Westminster establishment and institutions, such that voters in England, communities in England, finally have a chance for a better democracy that they otherwise would never have had at the ballot box?
But I mean, this is an obvious question, but I'll ask it anyway. But if they don't want that, why should they have it? I mean, if people anywhere see no future in change, why should change be forced upon them?
I wouldn't have argued it's change being forced upon them, because how that reform manifests and materializes, thanks to this catalyst, is entirely down to communities across England. A good example of this is if you look at polling for different policies, particularly in the US, universal healthcare is overwhelmingly supported amongst, both Democratic and Republican voters, but neither of the two parties are willing to actually endorse universal healthcare as an actual competent and cohesive policy. And so it doesn't matter how they vote in elections, they're not going to get universal healthcare regardless of who they put into power. And so this is kind of a similar situation, but in a constitutional sense in the UK, where people are not going to get electoral reform, people are not going to get pragmatic reform, people are not going to get economic reform. They're not going to get any of these things just through a simple vote. What they need is a catalyst that delivers that change. And for England, that can come in the form of Scottish independence.
But again, it would be forced upon them. I mean, there were people in one part of the island would decide that they wanted a different constitutional settlement and would set off down that path without consulting the others. And I know some people I speak to south of the border are alarmed at that prospect because they say there should always be consultation. Nobody should act peremptorily, and we should all have a say in it. The difficulty with that argument is obvious, which is that if a vast majority of people decide that change isn't appropriate for whatever reason, they dislike it being forced upon them. It's a human reaction. It's got nothing to do with nationalities or states or constitutions. It's just a perfectly normal human reaction to say, look, this is not what I want. I know you want it, but I'm not sure I want it. Besides, there's an argument that says it's much more likely that constitutional change will be forced on Scotland by a general collapse south of the border, i.e. that the present arrangements are unsustainable.
Yeah.
They're just unsustainable. I mean, I'm not alone in saying this and suggesting it, but if they become hugely unsustainable, then Scotland might end up independent by default, for the simple reason that just people say, look, we've got to focus on ourselves. And that would be appropriate, because unlike Scotland and Ireland and Wales, England has never had a conversation.
Yes.
There's never been a discussion like this, ever, really, to speak of. And therefore, you get a typical problem when people don't talk. They don't know what each other want, and therefore they can't accommodate very often. It's an interesting. But tell us more about your background. You're a working class lad.
Yes.
Who's now deeply into astrophysics. So how did that happen?
It's a very convoluted story, so I'll try to keep this as succinct as I can. If I start to ramble, you're allowed to tell me off.
Don't worry, I shall.
So when I was younger, I grew up in a very working class community. I come from a working class family as well. And for full context, I come from a Protestant, monarchist, kind of royalist, orange family. I was surrounded by a community of predominantly orange neighbours as well, except the only difference between them was I was a Jambo, they were Rangers. Now, that might seem completely off topic, but I began to kind of resent the idea of religion for a little while, because I often saw through my neighbours, through certain members of my family, through other people, that religion was being used, and in particular Protestantism, as a form of justification for sectarianism, for racism, for abuse, for misogyny, for all these kind of things. And it genuinely was, quite traumatizing in a lot of ways. And when you kind of, it completely reevaluated my relationship to the church for the longest time, to the point where I ended up becoming atheist before I even knew what that word was when I was like 8. The reason that that's kind of important is because it then led to me being like, so what actually did happen? I don't believe that there is a God that would justify these kind of things, that he would want or she would want or they would want these things done in their name. And so it kind of put me in this state where I was like, I want to know. I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's happening in the world around me. I want to know what's made everything up. I want to know the answer to everything. And in my naivety and stupidity, I decided to become a supporter and wanting to learn physics, which, if you are a young aspiring physicist, beware, it is hell on earth when it comes to mathematics. But it is thoroughly rewarding because you do get to answer some of these questions, albeit in a very convoluted way that you end up having even more questions to ask. Frustrating in a lot of ways, but hey ho. I think that's where kind of my background came into it. I was the first person in my family to have gone to university. I was 17 years old in secondary university because I skipped the first year. And that came with its own kind of hurdles as well. I was often kind of looked down upon or kind of shafted a little bit because of my age. I remember actually one of the first reports I ever done, I got an A for my report, but I had it marked down to an E because I needed to get a signature that no one told me I needed and was presumed knowledge because I was coming in from first year, although I was not. I skipped the first year.
Which university was this?
Oh, Heriot-Watt.
Oh, it's mine, my alma mater.
Don't get me wrong, love Heriot-Watt, fantastic university. Just this one professor seemed to have a gripe with the idea of a 17-year-old being in a second year lab surrounded by 19 and 20-year-olds. So, but you always come to these kind of hurdles. You always come to these situations where people kind of view you differently. And when it came to being working class, it was quite frustrating as well, because there was a lot of my peers who did come from affluent backgrounds, particularly those that were from England, who had come to study in Scotland. The vast majority of them did not need to work. And so that meant that myself and many other working class students were having to work part-time alongside our degree. Yeah. So we were at a time management disadvantage and a fiscal disadvantage at trying to get the exact same grades and qualifications as our peers. So it was not an easy journey, but thanks to the fact that we do have free tuition in Scotland, and in particular, the Scottish government, the SNP, scrapped the back-end tuition fees from Labour. That then allowed me to be able to go on to my PhD, something I would not have been able to afford to do.
Yeah.
And so, it's been a difficult journey, but I want young people, in particular young working class people, to know that it is possible. It's not an impossibility anymore. It's not something that's reserved for these affluent people that you see across the street. Trust me, if you've got the willpower, if you've got the passion to do it, put your mind to it genuinely. Like I believe in you in the same way I had to believe in myself.
Let's not understate the difficulties, because you outlined the challenges when you come from a working class background, like I did too. Let me share a story with you, if I may, and with everyone else. My honours degree project was to build a correlator, electronic device that would sample signals and remove the clutter and present the signal in its pure form. You do this by autocorrelation, i.e. you compare the signal with itself, or cross-correlation where you compare it with something else. It's not mathematically obtuse, it's very straightforward, and compared to the work you've done, frankly, is simplistic. I was in an empty lecture theatre with the supervision at the top, all these grey-haired individuals at the top of the room, and I went through my pieces, and this guy interrupted me after about 10 minutes and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "Well, it's a correlator, it's doing it." He said, "I just don't get this." I thought, hold on a second, I'd just been to Hewlett-Packard, where they were building them at South Queensferry way back then. And I thought, this is nuts. These guys need to get out there and see what's happening in the real world. And I was only describing what somebody else had attempted to do somewhere else as a commercial. possibility. And he couldn't understand it from an academic point of view. And I thought, this is so you have to be tenacious, as you have demonstrated. You have to have that tenacity that says, hey, I believe in me because somebody believed in me, I believe in me, and I'm going to press forward because I know at the end of the day, this is going to work out for me. But you have to be strong-willed, as you are. You can't be put off by the random passages of wind that come at you from all sorts of different directions. So, Lynn Copeland's name popped up there for a second. Let me ask you a question that Lynn had submitted in advance, if I may, Callum. She said, "Hi, Callum, could you please outline the various roles that you have within groups that are not allied to the SNP, like the Scottish Currency Group?" Would you like to do that, Callum?
Yeah, sure. So I am active in a lot of different groups, like political groups, out with the SNP, and not just political groups, but obviously predominantly politics, because I like doing that in my free time. It's not physics at the end of the day. I am in the Scottish Currency Group, where we are advocating for an independent Scotland to have its own currency and therefore establish its own unique banking framework and systems. I think that we could rightly do what the vast majority of other countries do, such as countries that I've lived in, including Switzerland, when I worked at CERN, and also in Tanzania, where you have your local currency that everything is pegged to in terms of price, but you also still list things in other prices. You've probably seen this before if you've went to H&M or Zara, because they do this already. And the idea being is that we would still accept the British pound, we would still accept the EU euro, but the point being is that the price would still be pegged to the Scottish currency. And that to me is the priority of this. I do think it's a necessity because we wouldn't otherwise have the powers over, for example, printing money. So I do think that it's important for independents to pursue this. There's other things as well, like I'm on the board.
Before you move on, can I just ask you a quick question relative to Professor Mark Blythe, I think his name is, who spoke at the Scottish Economics Conference recently in Dundee. And he said his big concern was about the current account. He said it's fine to print your own money, and of course you can do that, and you can spend it on lots of things. But if you're not earning foreign currency, then you're in deep doo-doo. You need to have a good current account settlement somewhere on the line. What's your reaction to that? He was concerned that Scotland didn't have the things to sell that would generate that sort of income, and therefore the advantages of having your own currency were thereby largely nullified.
I mean, I don't disagree, but at the same time, I definitely don't agree. Like there are valid points to be raised in this context, but I don't think he's considered every single perspective and angle on this. At the same time, though, I'm fully aware that I'm not an economist. And so if I were to make any claims or assertions at the moment, I don't think I would word it correctly. And I'm not going to pretend, I'm not going to, make stuff up, if that makes sense. So I'm going to just be blunt in saying that I don't wholly disagree, but I definitely don't agree, and just leave it at that for now.
But you would encourage people to look more closely at the Scottish Currency Group and the work they're doing and to assess for themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think they're doing absolutely fantastic on is information. So the Scottish Currency Group have been doing fantastic at communicating effectively what it means to have a Scottish currency, why we need independence as well, and discussing any kind of disinformation or misconceptions around currency in particular. So I think that if you're really interested in having a rebuttal to a lot of, nonsensical British nationalist arguments, go straight to the Scottish Currency Group.
Okay. You mentioned rebuttal there. There's an issue that agonizes so many people in our audience, and it crops up time and time and time again, which is that the Scottish government has said that they have set up a rapid rebuttal unit charged with challenging non-factual information and remedying that, rectifying that. But time after time, and you've mentioned this earlier, you see You see prejudice masquerading as facts. You see an imbalance where somebody who is not an expert is fronted along with somebody who is an expert, and we're told that we should treat both of their remarks equally, which, from somebody with a scientific background, that's an anathema.
Yes.
Why should some dolt be afforded the same level of credibility as somebody who is a seasoned expert in the field? It makes no sense.
It doesn't. That's actually why I didn't answer the previous question. I'm not an explicit economic expert, so I'm not going to pretend to be as such and answer that question. That defeats the purpose of the rebuttal, because if you say something wrong, they're going to use that against you, even if what you've said isn't technically incorrect. The frustrating thing at the moment that I have with very specific journalists and political editors is that the things that they're doing at the moment would get myself and my colleagues fired or expelled from their research projects.
Yeah.
You need to have information that is fully sourced, resourced, fact-checked. You also can't present your opinion as fact. And far too often, that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment, it is just that. I do think that there's more that needs to be done in terms of rebuttal. The problem is, and I think this is kind of the more important aspect, is it's not explicitly the actual rebuttal itself. It's being able to communicate that to everyone. It's being able to make sure that that rebuttal gets out to everyone and everyone hears it. The problem that we have is we do have a hostile media that does not want to deal with rebuttals. They don't want to fact check. They don't want to resource things properly. And so when people are consuming that media, they are being denied that access to that rebuttal. So, and because broadcasting powers are also reserved, it's not as if we can sort of tackle that more instrumentally through regulations or the creation of a state channel. So that is, I'd argue, a bigger issue than the rebuttal itself, because there are rebuttals. It's just people don't know how to access them and they're not readily available to the public. That's what I see as the bigger issue here.
Maybe we were discussing this last week, and one thought that we had was that for young people, this is much less of an issue, because lots of young people do not consume this stuff. They do not read the Daily Mail. They do not read the Daily Express. They do not watch or listen to BBC Scotland. Well, that's not a prejudice. I'm just simply stating the facts. The numbers are falling like a stone. And of course, that arrangement, even though these publications are less popular, the rationale behind them is that they're not based on market forces. They're not based on income. They're based on what the government wants people to consume. So therefore, they're not in any way, shape or form at the mercy of market forces in the same way that other groups might be. So, and the BBC in particular would fit that bill. They don't care what the customers think of them, really, deep down, because they manage upwards to somebody in Westminster or somewhere, and it's not anything to do with the Scottish people. And there's no sovereignty, so therefore there's no real control over what the BBC's output is and whether it's conducive and sympathetic with the general opinions. Bearing that in mind, it's hardly surprising that we get the output we do, because it's not based on I need to reach out to an audience, or it's not based on that. It's based on the fact that I have a viewpoint and I intend to use that bully pulpit every single opportunity I get to thump this message across. Maybe and this is what we were discussing last week, and I'd like your view on this, please. We were talking about the fact that younger people do not consume this material, and the material they have access to and prefer is not written material in that sense. It's social media. So, which begs the obvious question, particularly in the light of your remarks about the 1 in 7 Scots young Scots who haven't voted yet, perhaps. How do we reach these folks?
The simplest thing is through social media and alternative media. as well as something that often kind of gets overlooked, which is civil networks. So starting with alternative media, this is a good example of alternative media, but there's others such as Novara Media, Politics Joe, TLDR News, Bylines, and they are all really useful in being able to actually get alternative perspectives that are less biased towards a government perspective, and in particular as well as a partisan perspective. So a lot of younger people tend to turn to them or through social media posts and groups and even just their friends to be able to get access to information. The primary issue, and this is something that is I'd argue the biggest issue that's facing Scotland at the moment and for connecting with younger people, there's a lack of alternative media for younger people or aimed specifically to younger people. There are UK-wide ones such as Novara Media or TLDR or Politics Joe, but they all fail when it comes to providing a comprehensive Scottish perspective because they often provide a very surface level, outsider kind of perspective, but frame it as an insider perspective. You know, you look at Euronews, and Euronews is able to competently, talk about Scottish politics, but they do so intentionally as an outsider because they recognise that they're commenting as outsiders. But that's where alternative media that's UK-wide tends to fail because they don't know how to talk about Scottish politics. So they end up getting things wrong. They end up unintentionally spreading misinformation. And that's why things like Bylines, of which I'm now a political editor for, on the editorial board for Bylines Scotland, because it provides that alternative perspective that's coming from civic journalism from people all across Scotland, from all walks of life, regardless of their views on things like independence. And what you're actually getting is competent research and fact-based articles that are not written with the intent of trying to spread misinformation or bias. It is intentionally trying to provide alternative perspectives, if it's opinion pieces like things I've written, or trying to inform the general public in a digestible manner that doesn't depend upon jargon. Also things that I've written when it comes to science. I've talked about nuclear energy, and I've talked about my work in particle physics, both of which was intentionally designed to try and communicate these really complex issues so that everyday people can read that and go, okay, that's actually not that complicated. It didn't need to be that complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable in many senses that the latest opinion poll shows that independence is running neck and neck, slightly ahead of the status quo. But it still puts the Labour Party ahead as far as Westminster is concerned, just by a fraction. I suspect they'll need a lot more than a fraction, particularly if we've got candidates who are racist. But the reality is that, let me ask you a leading question. Why not? What do you think of how do you rate communication in the indie movement?
I'd give it a B minus.
Is that 1 out of 10?
Oh, out of 10, probably about a 6, a 5.
Really?
Or 6. Yeah,
that sounds generous to me, Callum.
I'd say it's about right. From the perspective of what we're actually able to properly and effectively communicate. The primary issue to me is not inherently just down to communication. It's down to how do we provide the answers to questions or concerns that people have when it comes to independence. Now, for younger people, the reason why we are so overwhelmingly pro-independence, at the tune of about 70 to 80%, that's why we're called Generation Yes, is we overwhelmingly support independence, is because we have a skill that we've had to learn because we've been a generation that's consistently and chronically been online.
Yeah.
We know how to fact check, research, and understand things from our own perspectives without having that information needing to be conveyed to us explicitly. So in terms of being able to communicate that and having the information out there, I would say it's actually pretty okay. The information is readily available and, people can find it if they're willing to put in the time and effort. The problem is to do with the accessibility aspect of it, because it's not accessible. You have to put in a tremendous amount of work and effort to try and actually digest it, break down these complex, like political jargon topics and notions, so that you can actually understand the crux of what's being discussed. I'd say the biggest issue is coming down to having those answers readily available and addressing them through policy. That, to me, I'd say is the biggest issue. And if we can also overcome the fact that there's some infighting going on in the indie movement, that would be fantastic. That would make it so much better.
Well, you know something, there's a parallel with science here, which I'm sure you're not oblivious to, which is that there are lots of scientists working in the same field, and what makes them better in some respects is the fact that there is competition out there, is the fact that there are all sorts of different aspects, people doing different bits of research, and everyone knows that at some stage they're going to have to offer up their best work and have it tested against what is deemed to be a quality output. You could argue the same thing happens with independence. There's bound to be lots of people with different views on what form a new Scottish state might take, how to get there, etc., etc. This is not, if you look back at the development of independence or separatist movements over hundreds of years, they've all gone down this route. In fact, one of the biggest arguments by the colonialist powers for devolution is to bring about this very thing. Because the longer you delay it, justice delayed is justice denied. You set up frustration amongst independence groups. So you could argue it's actually contrived to bring about the situation we see now with different elements proposing different viewpoints. There's something healthy about it, but sometimes with a small h. But it does seem to me that there's, I don't see any evidence, correct me if I'm wrong here, of the SNP reaching out to the 1 in 7 Scots that you mentioned, who will be critical to any election and any referendum that takes place, perhaps subsequent to that. Is that the case?
I'd disagree, because the reason I'm in the SNP is because they did reach out in a lot of ways.
Okay.
Actions speak louder than words, and we see the policies that the SNP has championed and supported, from backing free tuition fees to supporting same-sex marriage and being the party that introduced same-sex marriage in the Scottish Parliament. We're seeing the SNP being the progressive and left-wing and pro-young people party that it touts itself to be. It's not the Labour Party that continually makes promises after promise after promise after promise and reneges upon it immediately after being elected, and then deprives young people, and in particular working class people like me, of opportunities that we otherwise would have been able to have gotten under the SNP. And so it's not just about the communication aspect of it. And yeah, as I said, there are communication issues that exist within the entire independence movement, not just the SNP. But actions speak louder than words. Policies speak louder than gestures. The SNP's policies have continually and consistently been aligned with what young people in Scotland want and need. And quite frankly, when we're facing a cost of living crisis, when we're facing a climate crisis and a democratic crisis, the party that is looking to address all three of those simultaneously, that is the party that we're going to support. And that's precisely why young people overwhelmingly back both the SNP and Ergo Independence.
This is categorically the case. There's no question about that. The numbers are consistent, that young people under 25, you're looking at 70, 80%, which is overwhelming. I mean, frankly, if you could get that sort of support in any other grouping, you'd be overjoyed. The Daily Mail would go into paroxysms of rage if it thought that 70% of over 50s were in favour of independence. But I think the challenge, though, accepting what you said, is how do you motivate these good folks, this 1 in 7 that you spoke of, to put an X on a piece of paper? I mean, it's, as you said, a lot of folks are more interested in social media than putting X's in bits of paper. And do they actually see and comprehend the direct connection between these two, or is there still a substantial group of people in that age range who say, well, all politicians are crap and they don't achieve very much? I mean, what's going to motivate people in your mind, Callum, to move from I'm very sympathetic, I really appreciate what's being done, and I want that to continue, and it means I have to do something?
It's a very simple answer, actually. Yes, policies. Now, I want people to kind of bear with me when I explain this, okay? I think and also believe that it's one thing to turn around and say that you support independence. The SNP is a pro-independence party, and I can say this because I'm a member of the SNP. I support the SNP wholeheartedly. We are a pro-independence party, and I'm very skeptical that there's almost anyone out there that actually believes that we don't support independence, that we're just devolutionists or whatever it is. And so I don't think we need to keep proving that we're pro-independence, because we are. My argument is that instead of trying to placate to these very specific types of independence supporters, we recognize that we still need to try and convert people to independence. And more importantly, we need to motivate people to turn out to vote. And the way to do that is through what I and many, many other young people have been referring to as yes policy.
Yeah.
The idea being is that if you can generate a policy that can prepare us for independence, can facilitate and enable good governance within the Scottish Government, and can demonstrate a better alternative than what we currently have within the United Kingdom, that's going to motivate people to turn out to vote, because it's straight up giving people a positive alternative. It's showing exactly what they can get if they vote for the SNP, and it is making it easier and facilitates a faster transition to independence. So those that are skeptical or those that are on the fence, especially when it comes to stability, they have that reassurance in place that they know that it will no longer be unstable. A good example of this is research. And I can talk about this because I'm a researcher myself. What we need in Scotland, as far as I'm concerned, is a complementary equivalent body to UKRI, which is the UK's research body. Right now, that's comprised of 9 councils, one of which is Research England. The equivalent to that for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is not part of it. So that means that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are excluded from the governance of a UK-wide body in a lot of ways. We might interact and cooperate with them, but we're not explicitly part of that governance. That leads to a lot of mismanagement and neglect when it comes to investment in Scotland, as well as Wales and Northern Ireland. If we were to create a complementary, so not replacing, just a complementary body that is equivalent to UKRI in Scotland, that is able to deal with and facilitate research through a centralised body, centralising the SFC, SAS, and the skills network, you would then be able to provide a decent alternative to the UKRI. We're able to make up and mitigate for any neglect that ends up happening. We're preparing for independence, because that equivalent body will now have the full responsibilities and capabilities to take over UKRI's responsibilities overnight. So streamlining our transition in the context of research in the quaternary sector. And lastly, it provides a motivation to vote. It's a huge flagship policy that are people like, wait a minute, so this body can help invest in local communities by trialing innovative projects like glow-in-the-dark roads, for example, right? Like, these are the kind of things where if you're able to demonstrate the effectiveness that this has in local communities, people are going to want to turn out to vote and be like, I want that. I want that in my community. I want to see what that does for me.
Well, 2 questions. One is, have you already suggested this to the SNP and the Scottish Government? Good. And can you tell us how it was received?
It was received relatively positively. The primary issue is obviously trying to discuss with stakeholders within the sector to make sure that their opinions, their voices, and their needs are taken into account whenever we construct this. So at the moment, it was being received quite positively so far with people that I've spoken to.
The second point is that you made the point that we need to convince people to support independence, but the reality is that 70 or 80%, depending on who you talk to, of young people already support independence. You don't have to convert them. You don't have to convince them. All you have to do is to persuade them to actually put a cross on a piece of paper, either electronically or physically. And on the face of it, you could argue, surely that can't be all that difficult. I mean, we're looking now at, if somebody came to me as a political operative and said, you could get 600,000 votes tomorrow morning, I'd grab their hand off. I'd say, fantastic. Because to motivate 600,000 old people to go and vote is a major undertaking. Whereas these folks are out there, you can reach them on social media. It doesn't cost you anything. You just have to have smart people like you and our previous guests and say, look, get your TikTok thing running, get everything running here, and for the government to support it. I mean, to me, the most effective rapid rebuttal unit would be some sort of TikTok channel that just took material that was being distorted and made it available to young people on an hourly basis. I mean, how expensive can that be?
Yeah, it definitely won't be. And I think the primary issue, the biggest issue, right, no matter how well we communicate, no matter how fantastic our policies are, voting will forever be an inconvenience for a lot of people, not just young people, for working class people, for disabled people, for rural communities in particular, trying to reach a ballot box station. One thing that like a lot of people tend to overlook when it comes to elections is it's intentional that elections are held on a Thursday. It's the fourth working day in the week. You've got another working day tomorrow. You're going to have to try and make your way to a polling station, which could very well be really inaccessible, could be far away from you.
Yeah.
You might need public transport that might not be frequent in your local area, especially if it's a Labour council. And so you end up with a situation where you just can't be bothered turning out to vote, especially if you don't feel like it's going to make a significant difference. If you at least...
Hold on a second, Callum. I take your point, but surely that's why postal votes were developed. And yes. You don't have to go anywhere. All you have to do is to apply for a postal vote. You sit at home and you say, there's my SNP candidate, cross, or whatever, electronically. You don't have to go to the polling station.
Well, yeah, there's that, but there's quite a lot of issues when it comes to postal voting. The first is it's not reliable in terms of where you're living. If you're a student and you're constantly changing address, getting a postal vote or registered for a postal vote can be quite a hassle if you're trying to vote your term time address. If you are also deregistered, for example, like if you've moved social house, there's a very good chance that you've been deregistered. And because of that, the chances of you being contacted by someone to get you registered to vote, let alone registered for a postal vote, it's difficult. So yeah, postal votes can help with these things, but it's not necessarily the be all and end all in terms of tackling that aspect.
I hear what you're saying. And some of these difficulties are largely insurmountable if you're traveling a lot and you're moving addresses. I can see that. Of course, there's also the proxy vote. I mean, I have a proxy vote, which I'm more than happy to let somebody cast on my behalf, because it means then that that vote is then secured, and I get feedback from the local authorities saying yes, we totally accept your qualification for so doing, and then it's just a question, filling in the paperwork when it comes along. We're running close to the end of time. We've got about 4 and a bit minutes to go. Are there any messages? Are there any issues, briefly, that we haven't covered, Callum, that you would like to have done in the short hour that's available to us?
There's loads of things that I would have liked to have discussed, and I'm more than happy to pop back on at some point in the future if people
try giving us the headlines then.
I guess actually, before I even bother with that, I do want to put a little bit of recognition because there was, for a lot of physicists, it was a pretty sad day yesterday. Yeah. Higgs has passed away, who was a very important figure for a lot of people in particle physics. The long story short is there's a reason why there's an entire particle named after him. And so it's quite upsetting. And I imagine that there must be an event potentially being held at University of Edinburgh where he was based in relation to that. So if anyone is interested in that, they can kind of look into it a little bit further. But I just wanted to kind of make that as a poignant note to say it's an unfortunate passing, and it is what it is, unfortunately. But
well, we all mourn his passing, and our thoughts are with his family and friends at this time. Because he made such a major contribution.
He did. He absolutely did. And it was partly his stuff that helped inspire me in a lot of ways to actually go specifically into particle physics. But you know, life happens is the point. But I do want to end it on a kind of more positive note, I suppose. I do think that, and I do want to be really optimistic about independence and about Generation Yes. I mean, I want to make it clear to people that are watching that the fact that there are 600,000 young people who were too young to vote in 2014, 2016, this is the next generation. We are the next generation. They talk about it being once in a generation. We are that next one. We want our voices heard. We want to have our say. We want our future on this planet, in our communities across Scotland. The fact that we support independence to this level proves and demonstrates without a shadow of a doubt, independence is absolutely an inevitability. It is going to happen, and all we need to do now is start preparing for it. So I hope everyone here has a little bit of optimism with that bit of knowledge in mind.
Well, you know something, I find that terribly inspirational, and what it makes me ponder is the fact that I don't hear this elsewhere. I mean, maybe the material I see from the SNP is heavily censored, and I would accept that might be the case. But I don't hear and see too many politicians, SNP politicians, saying this is inevitable. So what we're doing, we're working towards that end, that inevitable end, right? We've done the work, it's inevitable, this is what's going to happen, so therefore it behoves us all to work together towards this end. And when I think back about the situation in 1776, way back in the United States, that was pretty much the attitude they took. They assumed it was going to happen, despite the odds. They just said this is going to happen, and that's the way it was. You know, it's amazing. Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate your time. As you can see, we're almost at the end here, and you've got on screen some advertising for the march and rally in Glasgow in April. You'll see all the details there that you need, and you'll notice that we've got Marlene Halliday and Gordon Kemp from Believe in Scotland discussing the march next week on the show. So a big thank you to Callum. I wish we'd had a bit more time to cover some of these areas, Callum. But we're very grateful to you for joining us and for giving us your insights. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. As ever, we've got a formidable list of guests lined up. You've just heard me mention the folks who are coming up next week. And remember our little homily that we have on this show. The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. So to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, look after each other, take care, and don't forget the crowdfunder. Good night all.